All right, and welcome back to another Indy Investor Pod, the podcast where we just like to talk about Indy real estate investing. So a little bit from property management, wholesaling, notes and mortgages, fix and flip, anything that people are doing here in Indianapolis that just in the real estate investing world. So the point of this podcast is to help out anybody that needs something here in Indy when it comes to investing. We want to educate. We love to educate. So hopefully this helps you out. And with that, let's get on with the show. All right, and welcome back to another Indy Investor Pod. I am super excited to have my guest on here, Elisha Drake, today. So I think just one of the nicest, coolest people that I've met in really when it comes to real estate investing here in Indianapolis. So she owns View Property Group, and they do property management. They do a little bit of everything too, I feel like, as well. Just have had conversations with her. But Elisha, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. So awesome stuff. So let's kind of just get into this a little bit can you just give me a little bit of your background, kind of what you were doing and kind of what led you into kind of starting the View Property Group and just getting into property management, because who wants to do property management, Elisha?
Yeah. Well, I say you either love it or you hate it. And
Yep.
You usually know that within about 6 months. So it doesn't take long. My background is in property management. So I've spent about 15, well, I guess closer to 20 years. I'd like to not think it's been that long, but it has about 20 years in property management. I was a W-2 employee in the corporate world of property management, spent most of my career in multifamily apartment communities, ranging anywhere from 250 units to 1,000 units on average. But certainly worked my way into single family at one point. Worked in a publicly traded single family company, and got an experience with that as well. It was shortly after doing that I realized that I wanted to go out as an entrepreneur and start something new. So in January of 17, I left for the very first time. I left my W-2 position, left the corporate world, and jumped into, I wasn't sure at that time. I did a little retail sales. I opened up a brokerage with some other people, and we started a brokerage. We did flips all over Bates Hendricks and Fountain Square at that time was pretty prominent. Opened an office down on East Street, and just did a little bit of everything. Did some property management with a partner, and so on and so forth. It was in October of 17 that I actually decided that I was going to primarily focus on property management. So that is where I started with some local people that had a large portfolio that they wanted to have me help manage. I got started really at that point, and then I've just grown it by word of mouth since then. So we manage about 400 properties now.
Awesome. And that's pretty incredible to kind of go from, and that's basically within 3 years of growing to, 400 doors. So that's pretty impressive. And that word of mouth says a lot about you and kind of, and what you do. I'm going to skip back away from you for a little bit. Let's just talk about Indy.
Sure.
About why. So you've kind of grown that in 3 years to 400 doors. Must mean that's a pretty good rental market of why people want to invest in Indy, and that they can invest in Indy and have that many doors basically from different investors and stuff. So let's talk about that a little bit of why do you think Indy is such a great buy and hold market?
Yeah. So, I think it comes down to, the obvious would be, it's the second largest city in the Midwest, and 14th in the US. So, we've got, I think it's 2.1 million people here. We've got a great market for strong, diverse job market.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's huge. Housing costs and the cost of living is really big. My son actually lives out in the Seattle area, and so I hear a lot about that. His girlfriend's in property management out there, and the cost of living, and he wanted to invest there, and he's not able. He's having to invest here in Indianapolis, at home. So, we're well under the national average for cost of living and housing costs. Of course, the job growth, that's huge.
Mm-hmm.
We've had a lot of job growth here. I think a strong occupancy rate is another thing that we have here in the Indianapolis market. Basically the ROI boils down to having a tenant in place. Yeah. And we tend to see a high occupancy rate. In fact, we had a waiting list just a few weeks ago for people looking for properties. So another big one is the acquisition to rent ratio. You can have $995 a month gross rents coming in, and your mortgage be $320, $340 a month. And so that's really helpful as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, really good points that you brought up there, and just, great things that just kind of highlight the city of why it is such a great buy and hold market. And, you kind of mentioned too that it is the 14th biggest city in the US. And I always love it when investors come out here and they're driving around and like, oh, they know it's kind of a big city, but they're like, it doesn't feel big at all. It has very drivable, people are friendly, and it's really easy to kind of get around. And so I think that lends to, when we have investors coming to Indianapolis check out, if they don't live here, they kind of get a feel for really what everything that Indy does have to offer, and can check that out, which is really cool. And then when you just, some of the things just to highlight kind of what you said too, of just like when you have the affordability. So Indianapolis is one of the most affordable places in the US to buy a house, but then we still have so many, it's still like a 50-50 split in Indianapolis of people that are renting versus buying a property or having a mortgage on a property and stuff like that. So even though houses are affordable, people are still looking to rent. Number one, I've seen a lot of the younger people, they're looking to rent because they just want to go from, hey, I want to live in Fountain Square this year, and then I'm going to move to, I'm going to move over to Speedway next year. So people want to move around because there are a lot of like cool places in Indy as well. So I'm seeing a lot of people doing that. It's really neat. So let's kind of get into, so when you're working with investors, whether they're here local or out of state or anything, let's just talk about some things that people should consider when, hey, I buy a house, I'm going to, I'm looking to use it for buy and hold, when I'm looking for a property manager. So what are some things that I need to consider when, number one, I'm looking for a property manager, or just even looking to bring on a buy and hold opportunity for myself?
Yeah, I think that's some great questions there. So, I think the biggest question I would have, I'm an investor myself. I have investment properties. And when I'm thinking about the fact that if I were looking for a manager, what are some things that would be important to me? And I think that one of the biggest things is how much experience that person has, in property management specifically. So I think that's huge. I think another thing is, how is the business structured? So, for us, we do a lot of corporate style. So, having, being available Monday through Friday, et cetera, et cetera. And so just knowing when the management company is open, available for tenants, for owners, so on and so forth. I also think that another big thing that I find with investors is, the financials of it. Who is actually going to be handling my financials? How is my reporting done? Discussing communication expectations is another big one. So knowing how you're going to communicate with your property manager, how much communication that you want or need, and those are the biggest things that I've noticed from owners in regards to that, kind of what they're looking for.
Yeah. How do you handle that when you have that, me versus maybe somebody else, where you have one owner that like, they want an update like every day or every week, or they want to know like an individual thing, or you also have people that are just like, I don't want to know about the property, just make sure it's cash flowing, and that's all that matters. So how do you deal with the balance of that, of like knowing that, is it just, hey, this person I need to make sure I communicate with all the time, or this person just only communicate with the big stuff, or so how do you balance that?
It's a learning curve. Yeah. It's definitely a learning curve. So usually the first 2 or 3 months, we're learning one another. I think is really, we talk about that. So when they call me and they interview, and their interviewing process, they say, hey, look, I want to know how often I'm going to be able to speak with you. I have some owners that say, I want to have a Zoom call once a month. I just want to see your face. I just want to say hello, see your face, see how things are going. And I have some investors who say, I don't care to hear from you at all. I hired you for a reason, and that is so that I don't have to be bothered with anything. And so just knowing what those expectations are, and talking about that. And, I'll say to people, your question was, what if you have someone that wants to talk each week? That's fantastic. You may not always be able to talk to me each week,
Mm-hmm.
but certainly we have other people. We've grown our staff along with the number of owners, along with the number of properties. We're growing our staff in the same manner. So there's plenty of people to talk to. It just may not always be me,
Right.
but certainly I try to make myself available to all of my investors. That's my focus.
Mm-hmm. No, I really like that. It's a learning curve and kind of getting people, feeling each other out. And it really is just any type of business relationship, whether you're, going to work for somebody or bringing somebody onto your team or anything like that. That's what it is. It's going to be that trial period, and it's not going to be perfect at first. It's not going to be exactly what you need or what they need, but it's feeling that out. So that's great stuff. I want to kind of dig into that maybe a little bit more on just like kind of the expectations. So I know when people are looking for property managers, because it is kind of like, hey, they're interviewing you, you're interviewing them. So it's a unique relationship. And I know, some property managers will do this, some people will do that, the owners, same thing. So let's kind of talk about maybe just the expectations of what are some realistic expectations that owners should have of their property managers here in Indianapolis, and then kind of the opposite side of that too, of like, what are some expectations that property managers can have of the owners of the properties as they're kind of going through that, building that relationship.
Yeah, so as far as property managers and their expectation of owners, I'll kind of start with that. I think for me, the biggest thing that I spend time on is sharing fair housing with the owners. Certainly being an investor and knowing what questions to ask of your manager, and knowing your numbers and your lenders and so on, that's a huge part of it. But in our world of property management, fair housing is huge. And so
You
it can
mean
be
owners just can't do
something.
whatever they want?
That's right. That's right. And wouldn't it be great if we could,
Right.
right? Wouldn't it be great? But we can't. So, we have to be careful. I know owners will oftentimes want to look through all of the applications and pick their favorite tenant on paper. And that's really just not how the fair housing rules work. Of course, we have, owners that prefer not to have pets in their properties, and certainly we try to adhere to that. But if someone does have an emotional support animal, there are rules and regulations. So I think the education of fair housing, why we're not willing to just throw someone's credit report out and share those things, why we process applications the way we do, why we have our tenant qualifications visibly available on our website, because we're treating each person the same way and having to meet those guidelines. So the education on fair housing, I think, is the largest, most important thing that we as property managers need to do for our owners, because we've studied that, we've taken classes, we've learned that, and so we need to share that information. So I think setting the expectation of what they can expect when they're using a property manager versus being their own landlord, I think that's the most important thing. Obviously, maintenance, making sure that they're understanding that while they may have just rehabbed this property, that does not mean that if they have a home that's built in the 1900, 1905, 1910, that they aren't going to have a sewage backup with the clay pipes and so on and so forth happen in their basement, which can lead to some very expensive costs for cleanup and repairs. So, just understanding that just because a property was cosmetically rehabbed does not mean that we won't encounter some larger maintenance. And so it's important to have that emergency fund and things like that. Another thing would be just safe and habitable, making sure that owners understand what that means and what's the expectation is there. Sometimes we're buying properties that are a great deal, and we're fixing them up and they look pretty, but we want to make sure that they're safe and they're habitable, and that sort of thing. So I think that would be the expectation for the owners. For the owners of the property managers, what I hear from people when they're either switching companies or they have talked with other investors and said, hey, these are the things that are most important to me. And I think it's communication and responsiveness. They want to know they'll even ask me, what is your time frame, that if I send you an email, when would I expect a return email? And so, our answer is 24 hours, phone call, email, 24 hours every time, all the time. And I think that just knowing that and that helps alleviate, if they contact us on a Thursday, we're all in the field. that they know by Friday we're going to get back with them, instead of wondering, oh my goodness, are they still in business? Is my property still okay?
Yeah.
Who
Yeah.
knows,
And then also not necessarily expecting like, oh, okay, I sent them an email. Like sometimes it's not going to happen. Like they're not going to get a response like within 15 minutes. Sometimes because
Sure.
you're doing your job. So sometimes you are out in the field, you're doing things, you can't respond right away, but hey, 24 hours, we'll get back to you. So yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes you're Johnny on the spot. We do a day in the field, a day in the office. So, it just depends on if it's the day in the field or the day in the office. But, I think accurate financial reporting is huge.
Yeah.
Just understanding the knowledge of the person that's doing the financial reporting. Is that a set person in that company that's doing that? Is there a CPA? Is there a bookkeeper? Who's doing that? Because that can be some issues there with that if the financial reporting is incorrect. And then of course market knowledge, just knowing, helping set rents. We spend a great deal of our time with investors reaching out and saying, hey, I'm about to get this property.
Mm-hmm.
Can you run the rents for me? And we do that for them because it's a very important part of getting their pro forma together.
Yeah.
So I think, their expectation would be having that team member who's willing to work alongside the wholesaler or the real estate agent or whomever they're using to get this deal, and being able to be a team member, be part of that team.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I think that's so important to have your property manager that can be involved in that process, because it's really easy to look at your numbers and be in a spreadsheet and be like, oh, this makes sense. This makes a great deal. But by not necessarily having that property manager involved on knowing exactly what it can rent for, or what, estimate of what it could rent for, and you're not just going off the wholesaler's numbers or off of what Rentometer says or anything like that.
yeah.
That's why you have the team. That's why you're working with a property manager to help out with that stuff, to make sure you're right on your numbers as an investor. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think that, another thing that we have helped out with, and I think would be great, is the scope of work.
Mm-hmm.
Our investors will find their own contractor to do the work, but certainly looking over the scope of work. We had one where they wanted to finish the garage, and I assured them that finishing the garage would not prohibit the property from being rented, right?
Mm-hmm.
So just things like that, where we can kind of cut down on some of the unnecessary things for a rental.
Yeah. So, let me ask you, what is like do you have like a story of just like the craziest like request that an owner has asked of you when it comes to working with a tenant or placing a tenant or anything like that? Is there anything that just stands out? Of course, without mentioning any names, or just like, we were like,
Yeah.
what?
Oh goodness. Well, we have that quite a bit actually.
Yeah.
And again, it goes back to owners just maybe not quite knowing the rules and regulations that management companies have to go by. Um, yeah, I probably have some stories, but I don't think I can think of one really good one off the top of my head. So I may have to come back on your show, and I'll bring a good story with me
There we
the
go.
next
That
time.
sounds. Well, I guarantee we could do probably a 3-part episode on just like stories between owners and tenants and all that stuff. So because I'm sure you get some
Yeah.
really unique requests from tenants as well. But that's really what I want. Like I think that's one of the big things I think a lot of people miss with the property management of, you don't just represent the owner of the property, you also represent the tenant. And kind of that is a play back and forth. That's what you're there for. So my wife was a director of HR for some organization out in Indy, and like she was there to help out the company and help out the employees. She wasn't there for either one. She was that kind of middle person. Same thing with property management. You're there to look out for the best interest of the tenants, because that they are also your client. It's not just the owner. I think some people lose that on both ends sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
can you talk about that a little bit, of just kind of maybe going through building that relationship up and getting people to kind of understand that a little bit of like, hey, I understand that you want this for your property, but we have to look at this. And it does come back to the fair housing and everything like that too, but
Mm-hmm.
of just how important that is for, I guess, owners and tenants to understand that, hey, you are there, you're that middle person, but you're there for both of them.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, and I think you're exactly right. I think that oftentimes tenants aren't really thinking about that from the owner perspective, and I do think that owners are pretty good
Mm-hmm.
for the most part about thinking about it from a tenant perspective.
Good.
Uh, at times, I think the biggest the biggest time that we'll have an issue will be maintenance issues when a tenant is requesting a specific item and an owner doesn't want to maybe move forward with that item because it eats into their cash flow. So that tends to be where we have the most trouble or confusion or upset. But for the most part, I think just being firm and but also flexible with the tenants is important. You know, the tenants tend to, there are times when the tenants tend to kind of push the limits a little bit, you know, and ask for things like you said, the funny stories of things that they're asking for, and they really have a high expectation. So I think just explaining to them, you know, being open with them, explaining to them why we're not able to do something, or being flexible. For instance, a storm door. We may not be able to put in a $300 storm door. However, great news, we can authorize you to put in the storm door, and you can actually take that with you when you leave. So it's a win-win, you know, something like that. So just kind of working through some of those things. You know, COVID certainly has changed things a little bit as well. And, you know, owners are expecting rents, and they're expecting them on time. They are expecting that their tenant's going to be on time. So on the 6th day of the month, we are typically giving every owner a list of the property or the list of the tenants that haven't paid yet. And, you know, it's hard to, a lot of times they want to go ahead and charge the late fees, but maybe we should waive them during this time, and just trying to kind of work through being empathetic, but not sympathetic, you know, being firm, but flexible, providing the tenants resources for getting those rents in, you know, here's where you can get help, but also doing our best to try to get those rents in, because we've committed to that for our owners. So I would say the COVID has been the toughest for me personally, because I'm very structured and not being able to just say, you've got to have it in right now, and if you don't, here are your consequences. So I think it's definitely been a learning challenge for all property managers during this time, and for all owners.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, do you have any, just any advice or even like any prediction on kind of what's going to happen within Indianapolis when it comes to, hey, evictions, we're able to file evictions again, or I guess the courts are able to hear evictions again. Do you have any just insight on that?
Yeah, so it's going to be very interesting. I honestly didn't expect another month of an extension on the moratorium. So that was a little bit of a surprise, and I don't know why it was a surprise to me, but it was a little bit of a surprise to me. Certainly, I know that the backlog in the courts is going to be, I'm sure, astronomical. So, you know, just trying to work with these tenants and be sure that they're reaching out to every resource possible. There's lots of churches, lots of resources out there that have been helping prior to COVID tenants. And we've had a lot of tenants be very successful in reaching out to those people for help and getting help. So I think just trying to encourage that. Sometimes when they call, they haven't tried to get any help anywhere. They don't know where to reach out to. And they're reaching out to us because that's the only people that they really know about. So I think just educating that tenant, and also explaining to them there's still consequences. It may not happen on the 15th of this month, but rest assured that this balance is still going to be due.
Right.
And so you're putting yourself in a predicament more than anyone else by letting this balance continue to grow. So I think the education to the tenant, you know, you hear on the news, you don't have to pay rent, you're not going to be evicted. What they don't share is what those consequences are of not paying mortgages and not paying the rents and so on and so forth. And sometimes the tenant just needs to hear that. And it makes it more of a, I guess they tend to at that point start searching out for that help.
Yeah. And just having that open line of communication, just letting them keeping them in the know. Cause like they're hearing things from, you know, one news channel and it's different on the next news channel, or what they see on Facebook or any of that stuff, or what they're hearing from their aunt or whoever it may be. Just keeping that communication open and keeping them in the loop on what is going on is so important. And then I know a couple of the things that I've really done with some of our tenants too, just like kind of reminding them of like, hey, I understand you're in this situation. Here's some programs, here's people that can help. but also, I'm always willing to work with you or help you if I know that you are taking care of the property and that you're being a good neighbor. Like those are things that are just as important sometimes as collecting rent, because at least I know my property is being taken care of and it's a good hand. So if I drive by and I see something, like, I'm going to be less likely, kind of work with you on your rent and things like that. So just
Mm-hmm.
keep that in mind. And I know, a big thing is, with us and a lot of other investors too, just kind of doing the cash for keys. If there is an issue, because sometimes if they can't pay rent, sometimes it is a money issue. They might have some place to go, but they just need some money. So, hey, we'll go ahead and we can break this lease if you accept, this for, cash for keys or doing things like that. So I know that, that's been a strategy that a lot of people have been working. Have you guys been working that strategy as well? Or do you have any kind of tips on how to work with that within the system?
Yeah, so we've had a couple of, about two actually, right now that
Mm-hmm.
are interested in doing that. So I definitely think, we've reached out to our attorneys and kind of got some some feedback from them on how to maybe do that and be sure that we can come to a really good agreement and such. So we are working through about two right now on that. So I definitely think that that's an option. That is not something prior to COVID that I was ever a proponent of,
Yeah.
or ever really wanted to do, or even thought about doing. To be honest with you, I probably would not have been willing to ever um, give someone money for keys because I had other options. I was
Mm-hmm.
able to
Yeah.
simply get them out of the property,
Yeah.
and I didn't want to. In my head, it was rewarding, right, for that behavior. But this is different.
Yeah.
This is a pandemic.
Yeah, and that's the thing.
And
It's one of those, like,
so
it's all options. Like it's this is problem solving, like, to the fullest. Like, hey, how do you
that's
what can
right.
we do? What do you need? What can we do? And it's moving pieces and putting that puzzle together. That's what it is.
Yeah, that's
So,
right.
I know we're kind of running short on time here, just about out of time. I do have one more question for you. When you're kind of
Mhm.
talking about the new investor, so that person that's maybe they're looking at their first property to, do a buy and hold and kind of bring on or onboard to it with a property manager and stuff. What's some advice you have for that person that's kind of just starting off? Maybe something that a lot of people maybe miss, or something you just like, hey, this is like, definitely make sure you do this.
Yeah, so I always say, what's your exit strategy? So interesting enough, the very first thing, and me as an investor, the same thing. Before I even put the purchase agreement in, I want to know what the exit strategy is.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second thing is, what's my backup exit strategy, right? So exit strategy, I think, is oftentimes never even really looked
Yeah.
at the front end. And I actually think it should be the very first thing that we do. The other thing is numbers. We run the numbers, and that's great. But do we have good, solid numbers? Are they numbers? Where did we get the rents from? What are you basing your maintenance and your vacancy loss on? Do you know the area well enough to know what you might find in those particular areas in that particular property? Did you get the inspection report back and actually figure out what your CapEx item or deferred maintenance is? And did you calculate that in, or did you take the percentage that someone told you to put in, or that you got off the internet? What are
Right.
you basing that off of? So I think that making sure the numbers are right, and sometimes we see a property and we fall in love with it. That happens to me all the time. I drive by and, oh, that is so cute, I just want to get that one. And I try to like work the numbers
Yep.
in. Well, I probably won't have to do this because it's here or there or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's not really. I'm letting my emotions get control there. So I think that just making sure your numbers are working is huge. Emergency fund, that's a big one. I'm finding that right now,
Yeah.
actually,
Mm-hmm.
having that emergency fund, especially if you have 10 properties and you've got half of them not paying, that can be really something. And then I think that two other things I would mention would be multifamily. So I sometimes see people have a pro forma, they're purchasing a multifamily, and their pro forma indicates single family numbers. And so I think that that's important to understand, that pro forma needs to change significantly, primarily on vacancy, maintenance, and turnover costs in your pro forma when you're doing a multi. So I think that that's one thing I would point out on that. And then strategy. So, I don't think that everyone has the same strategy. Some people may not necessarily be looking for cash flow, but they have a tax strategy on why they're purchasing a particular property. So I think that, it's great to compare notes, but I think it's also great to know what your particular strategy is and what's best for you, and just sticking to that. So.
No, awesome stuff. Really appreciate that, and really appreciate those insights. Fantastic. Like I said, just information stuff. Really appreciate it. Elisha, if somebody wants to reach out to you or the View Property Group, how can they get in contact with you or your group or a website? So maybe tell us just a little bit of kind of about, this is your chance to kind of just, brag about yourself a little bit, brag about your company, and then where can they go to find out some information about you guys?
Yeah, absolutely. So they can go online, theviewpropertygroup.com. And I always tell people, remember, View is spelled V-U-E, View. So it's theviewpropertygroup.com. We have a lot of information on there. We also have a link where you can contact us, and that will actually come directly to me. And then I'd be able to reach out. We also can be reached by phone, 317-762-4949. Any of us would be happy to help, but probably the contact us would be the best way. That way we can get something on the calendar and set up a time to connect.
So awesome stuff. Appreciate it. Love it. So great episode, great information. Really appreciate you being on here and just, being open with, these tips that you have for investors out there and things to look out for here in Indianapolis. So with that, that's a wrap for the Indy Investor Pod. If you have any more questions for me or about the show, or have any topics that you want us to cover on the show, do reach out to me at brian@simplewholesaling.com or hit me up on social media. Love to connect with you on there. And with that, that's it. So thanks a lot, everybody. And we will see you on the next episode of the Indy Investor Pod.